There we go.
I'm all set up whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I'm just going to wait for the guy to come back. Okay, so can everybody hear me okay? Yes? In the back? Okay. I guess we can get started now. My name is Eric Williams. I work for Red Hat on the platform team for Eclipse, mainly SWT on Linux, specifically GTK. I'm in the Toronto office. I've been working for Red Hat for about 2 years now, first as an intern, now full-time since May. I've been a SWT committer since last February, so almost 2 years now, year and a half, 2 years. And this is my first EclipseCon and my first individual talk, so let's see how this goes. So first off, I assume you all know what SWT is, but I'll give you a brief overview just in case. It's a cross-platform GUI toolkit written in Java, originally developed by IBM, now at the Eclipse Foundation, and now maintained by Red Hat and a few other contributors, including IBM still. So the whole purpose of SWT is that you can create native-looking applications using a unified API. So you can develop for Mac, Windows, Linux, and you don't have to worry about dealing with individual toolkit constraints yourself. You can just write one application in Java, and it will look native on each platform that you run it. So more specifically about how this works, on each platform there is an implementation of SWT, and using JNI we interact with the native toolkit. So on GTK, for example, there's a file os.java in the backend behind the scenes, and when you create a text widget, for example, it goes down into JNI, queries the GTK calls, and you get a text widget that is created in GTK, but you don't have to worry about it. You're just only dealing with the Java side of things. And there are two types of widgets in SWT. There are native widgets, which are the ones that look native on each platform, which is the variety, excuse me, the majority of most widgets. And then there are common widgets, which you would see in the IDE sometimes, the CTab folder, for example, when you click the tabs in the console. That's a common widget, and that means basically that it looks the same on all three platforms. It's drawn manually at the Java level. There's no native toolkit involved with that. It's just, it's manually drawn. So those are basically the two types of widgets we have in SWT. So now a little bit about GTK, since it's kind of relevant on Linux. It's been around for almost 20 years. It's open source, one of the most popular C toolkits around for the Linux side of things, maintained by the GNOME Foundation. There are ports for OS X and Windows actually, so in a technical sense, GTK is cross-platform just like SWT is, on the same platforms as well. It uses GObject, which is kind of an object-oriented system using straight C. So if you don't want to use C++ or Java, you can get some object-oriented stuff in C. It's a bit hacky, but you know, it's there. And along with GTK, there are some other dependencies that come bundled. GTK, for example, is a lower level drawing toolkit which deals with geometry and the OS display. So for example, on X11, all the X11 calls are bundled into GTK. So for example, these things are not necessarily straight widget manipulation. It's more like if you want to do some custom drawing or the more particular details of geometry, that would be in GTK. Then we have Accessibility Toolkit, which is ATK. That basically adds support for assistive technologies. The most common one is Orca. So for example, if you're visually impaired, you can start Orca and the screen reader will read to you what's displayed on the screen. And SWT makes use of this on GTK, and on Windows and Mac, of course, there's also accessibility support, but this is Linux specific. And then we have Cairo, which was introduced in GTK2, which is basically a specific drawing toolkit. You can do all sorts of kind of custom drawing with that wouldn't really exist in GTK. And SWT on Linux pretty much uses Cairo exclusively. The support for non-Cairo drawing was dropped about a year ago, so that's gone. So here we have a quick diagram of how SWT interacts with these different libraries. Basically, there's a middle layer where you have the native toolkit. And then via JNI, we query the operating system for resources and to make our calls and get events. So these travel both ways. Although the arrows are actually one directional, but in theory there's bidirectional communication. So the events come up from the operating system through JNI into SWT. SWT manipulates them into the Java-only SWT event system and then sends them off to the user so that the user can make use of them through the API. So this is what SWT looks like on GTK. As you can see in the top right there, there's a button. It's a native GTK button, so I wrote that in C using the GTK API itself. There's no SWT involved with that. And on the left, you see there are some buttons. These are created in SWT, and these two images look pretty much identical. And that's what we're trying to accomplish in SWT. It basically takes the heavy lifting away from the user and allows you to create something quick and simple without learning a toolkit on 3 different platforms. So to make sense of how this stuff works on GTK, we're going to have to go a little bit into GTK versioning, only because if I start talking about the different GTK versions and the differences, it's going to be a little bit confusing if you don't know exactly what I'm talking about. So basically there are 2 major versions supported by GTK right now, GTK2 and GTK3. GTK2 is rock solid stable, but it's pretty much in maintenance mode. I think they're only contributing security fixes to it. Outside of that type of stuff, nothing is really going into GTK2. A lot of things still use GTK2, either unmaintained applications or older applications that haven't been ported to GTK3. For example, GIMP, I believe, still uses GTK2. There's a GTK3 port in the works, but it's not 100% stable. And considering GTK3 has been out for a long time, that's pretty astounding, but I'm just using it as an example. I mean, there are still things that do use GTK2. GTK3, on the other hand, is the latest major release. It just recently finished active development last year, or actually no, earlier this year. And there's no new development happening, only bug fixes are being contributed. The new development is all into GTK4 now, which is due to be released in about 2 years, although there are already alpha builds coming out for it. Basically, SWT is supported on both GTK2 and GTK3, but GTK3 is where we're focusing all of our efforts, mainly because GTK2 is starting to be rolled back and a lot of platforms aren't even supporting it anymore. For example, a lot of operating systems will run GTK3 default and GTK2 isn't really a priority anymore. Also, there are only 2 people working on the GTK side of things for SWT, myself and my colleague Leo. So we don't really have the time to chase after GTK2 only bugs, so these types of things are being put to the side. Now, the difference between GTK2 and GTK3 are pretty much night and day. I'll show you a little bit more in a minute, but the reason why supporting both GTK2 and GTK3 is tough is because the API for the different versions is very different. They changed a lot of things in GTK3, which means that keeping up with GTK2 and GTK3 in the same toolkit means we have to branch in the code paths a whole lot. You know, like if it's GTK3 here, do this. If it's GTK2 here, do this. And that just adds a lot of complexity, which makes maintaining such a thing more difficult and time consuming. So GTK2 is really old. It was released originally in 2002. And it's basically what you would consider the Windows 2000 or Windows XP look on Linux. I'll show you a screenshot. So that's what GTK2 looks like. It's pretty old. Anyway, so there are a lot of basic things included with GTK2. Things like UTF-8 support and JPEG, G-Object 2.0. Cairo drawing came with GTK2 as well. And there are some font rendering mechanisms that came with GTK2 as well. So it's kind of like the base platform of GTK. Some of it still remains, but a lot of it has changed. So in GTK3, everything changed basically. We had GTK2 API, which was very stable, but also very centered around X11, especially in the GTK side of things. There are lots of changes in accessibility support, but most importantly, in GTK3, they started deprecating things. And I don't know if you keep up with the GTK3 release cycles or if you've been on mailing lists, but this has caused quite a few complaints with the GTK3 developers. Basically, they had an API starting in GTK 3.0 in 2011, And they've deprecated stuff and said, yeah, you know, it should continue to work, but in reality, a lot of the things they've changed have been completely broken, so this makes my life very much more difficult. And on top of that, the differences from one version of GTK3 to the next is pretty different. So for example, GTK 3.4 is closer to GTK2 than it is to GTK 3.22. So this means that if you're running a long-term support version of a distribution that came with like GTK 3.8, and we're trying to fix things for GTK 3.22, that the difference is going to be pretty stark. Now most distributions don't have that anymore. I mean, RHEL is already on GTK 3.22, and even the Ubuntu long-term support is GTK 3.18, but we still have a few users who wander into Bugzilla and file bugs against really ancient GTK versions. So even though we support these GTK3 versions, it's really hard to fix bugs that only exist on things that were released 4 and 5 years ago. So with the manpower constraints, it's a little bit difficult. But anyways, about GTK3, the biggest things that came with it was CSS theming. There used to be theming engines in GTK3. If you used KDE, you probably have some experience with the Oxygen GTK theming engine. These were kind of a GTK2 relic that they got rid of, thank God. They caused a lot of bugs. Things like Eclipse randomly crashing, things being misrendered, etc. So the biggest thing was that they standardized the CSS theming API. Basically, you can theme any widget any way you want using the API they've provided. And the other thing they changed as well was the sizing mechanisms. And that's a little more in depth, but basically the way you can size widgets, the way you can request sizes from GTK changed very radically in GTK3. But the most notable change is styling. So this is what GTK3 looks like. Compared to this, I would say it's a pretty good improvement. This is SWT running GTK3 control example on GTK 3.22. So if you download SWT right now and you run control example, this is what you'll get. So one of the things in GTK2 to GTK3 that we had to change in SWT was SWT Fixed. So in GTK2 we had this widget called GTK Fixed, which is basically a container. You toss widgets into it and you get absolute sizing. So you can say, yeah, I want this widget at 400 by 300 and it'll go there. In GTK3 what they did was they changed a lot of the access to internal structs. So for example, in GTK2 you could get a widget and you could get its class struct and you could say, hey, I'm going to manually manipulate the x, y, height and width values in the struct, and then GTK would just listen to you. In GTK3 the developers said, no, this is a terrible practice, we're not going to let you do that anymore. You have to go through GTK3's internal sizing machinery. Unfortunately for us, we kind of need that because we have absolute API. I mean, SWT has API that says, yeah, I'm going to set a widget size to 400 by 500 and you're guaranteed to get that. The same goes with positioning. So we can't really say to the user, yeah, I mean, you might get 400 by 500. That's really not on. So we had to kind of step in and fix that ourselves. So we have this thing called SWT Fixed, which is a custom GTK3 container widget that we've implemented at the C level. And basically, every widget in SWT has this as a parent, and it allows us to do manual sizing manipulation and absolute sizing and positioning. So that was a bit of an effort. This was created about 4 or 5 years ago, and it's mostly being maintained right now, but it does cause a little bit of friction because it's a custom widget, so it requires extra maintenance. And the emulated widgets, like CTab folder, the custom ones I was mentioning earlier, they are just drawn onto these custom widgets. So basically CTab folder, style text, all that stuff is just an SWT Fixed container with Java stuff being drawn onto it. So a closer look at GTK3, not to get too in depth, but these are kind of the highlights. We started off with 3.0, which was a major breaking change, that's why it's in red. Basically changed a lot of stuff from GTK2. They added the CSS theming support, they changed most of the fundamental API. So that was a big change. 3.2 to 3.6 was mostly okay. I mean, they added Wayland support and they brought ATK out of GTK as a module and sent it as a separate library. So there are some changes there. I'm actually working on accessibility right now because the GTK implementation of accessibility in SWT has been a little bit neglected since GTK2. It doesn't work at all. So I'm in the process of fixing that right now so that we're in line with what GTK3 is supposed to do. 3.8 to 3.14 was pretty drastic. They changed the sizing machinery, they added a bunch of widgets, they deleted a bunch of old ones. They added some high DPI stuff, some drag and drop, internal drawing changes, stuff like that. Most of the stuff, I'd say actually the vast majority of SWT bugs on GTK come from these versions. Things worked pretty stably until about 3.8, but between 3.8 and 3.14 a lot of stuff broke. And then the rest is a little bit better. We got some OpenGL support in 3.16. We got more CSS theming. By the way, it's worth noting with CSS theming, it wasn't part of the GTK3 API until very recently. So we had a lot of user complaints, for example, that background colors were broken on this version of GTK 3.18 or something, and we would say, okay, well, we'll take a look, but basically they keep changing the CSS theming API, and you know, it's not part of the API, so they don't actually guarantee that it works. So there's a bit of back and forth between SWT developers and the GTK team. I mean, I hang out in that IRC channel every day at work. I have to ask them stuff. Sometimes, you know, they say things are supposed to work and they don't. So there's definitely a lot of back and forth. I spend a lot of time talking to them and posting on their mailing list. And basically, here we are at 3.22 right now. There are some more sizing changes. They changed the way you can request size. They have height for width management, or width for height management, and this notion of preferred and natural sizes, which, like I said before, is a bit of a problem for us. SWT has no concept of a preferred size, or you know, GTK has this method of determining what a widget is supposed to be in terms of size. We don't really want that. We want to say, yeah, we have a widget. I want it to be this size. Give it to me right now. I don't want you to decide for me. So that's something, that's a battle we're fighting constantly. So as I was saying, we have the SWT API. That's pretty much the biggest thing. Most of the effort that we spend is making sure that the SWT API works. The changes from GTK version to GTK version are one of the other reasons of bugs that we still have left over to fix. And also maintaining the GTK3 port on itself there are multiple code paths. So for example, I said we had code paths for GTK3 and GTK2. Well, now we also have code paths for other versions of GTK3. So for example, if it's GTK 3.8, 3.14, 3.20, you know, we do different stuff here. So as these things break, there's the amount of work being created to maintain it keeps going up. So this is where we are right now. Work that's currently being done. So I would say this is the present portion of this this talk. And that basically is made up of two types of categories in terms of work. We have bugs. These are like just immediate breakages and glitches that you would report in Bugzilla. Earlier this week in the tutorial, I had some people talking to me about SWT bugs and consistent behavior. And then we also have big picture projects. And these are things that take a little bit longer, usually a few months, sometimes an entire release cycle. And they deal with absolute functionality categories. Like for example, accessibility support on GTK3 was completely broken until a few months ago. These things are major projects. They take a lot of time to investigate. It's not just a quick bug fix. You have to spend, you know, we're talking about thousands of lines of code being changed. You have to investigate with the GTK guys what's going on, how it's supposed to work. You have to really dig deep. So accessibility is one of those. WebKit is another one. Leo is kind of the WebKit expert, but I'll speak on his behalf since he's not here. Basically, we have we're porting SWT to be compatible with WebKit 2, since a lot of operating systems these days don't ship with WebKit 1 anymore. So for example, if you try to run something with that has to do with the SWT browser widget, which uses WebKit, and you don't have WebKit 1 installed on your operating system anymore, there could be crashes. So obviously there's like Nebula uses basically exclusively the browser widget to do a whole bunch of stuff. People use the browser widget to render JavaScript. So we need to make sure that the browser widget works rock solid, stable all the time. So Leo is working on that. It's almost finished, but there are still a few bugs. And then I also worked on the SWT colors. Basically what happened was, in GTK2, colors didn't support transparency right out of the box. And in GTK3, they added support for transparency, so like alpha values. And until last year, SWT didn't support this transparent color system right out of the box. Now we do. There's still a few issues to be ironed out, very, very minor ones, but by and large now we have transparency support. So if you want to create a widget that's, you know, red but only 3/4 opaque, you can do that. Before you couldn't. So now we also have Wayland, which makes things a little bit more interesting. I don't know if there are many Fedora users in here, but Wayland has been the default for I think 2 releases in Fedora now. Other distributions are going towards Wayland as well because it doesn't come with the baggage that X11 has. For example, Ubuntu has dropped Mir support and is going back to the GNOME stack, which includes Wayland. So as distributions start to shift towards using Wayland more regularly, we're going to have to make sure that SWT works properly. Right now, it's still a bit buggy. There are certain things on Wayland that are done completely differently than we're used to. For example, there's no notion of global positioning on Wayland. And basically, not to get too in depth about Wayland, but Wayland isn't meant to be a rectangular screen like you're used to in X11. So for example, the Wayland compositor could run on something that's not a square. It could be a star, a sphere, a cylinder, basically anything. So you can't, there's no notion of absolute positioning on, you know, a star-shaped thing. You can't say, yeah, I want something at 100 by 200. This doesn't work. So things like control.setLocation are kind of broken because of that. If you start Eclipse on Wayland right now, the splash screen will show up kind of randomly in different corners of the screen depending on what mood Wayland is in that day. So that's something that obviously needs to be fixed. Drag and drop is still a bit broken on Wayland, although we had an intern who recently went back to school and he put a lot of work into fixing drag and drop on Wayland, but there are still some issues. So these are things that we have to look at going forward if we want SWT to survive, because otherwise people will just, you know, run Eclipse and on GTK3 on whatever the latest distribution is, it just won't work. And people will get frustrated and, you know, use something else. So it's very important for us that we fix these kind of blockers and these miscellaneous issues. It's also worth noticing that under miscellaneous issues, a lot of people quit over things that are kind of insignificant at first, but build up over time. So for example, a tooltip that's the completely wrong color or is unreadable might not seem like a blocker bug right at the outset, but if someone is doing development and they encounter an unreadable tooltip, you know, 100 or 200 times a day, they're going to start to get really angry about that. So bugs that come into Bugzilla, that they all get the same priority, but you kind of have to think, okay, if it's not something that a lot of users encounter, maybe we should put it on the back burner and deal with things that are accessible in the JAT every day that users encounter. And GTK4 is another big one. So this one I'll go into a little bit more in depth. Basically in GTK4 they're changing a lot of stuff in GTK3. So if you thought that the GTK2 to GTK3 switch was bad enough, GTK4 is probably going to be even worse. They're dropping some functions that are in the basic widget class. So the way GObject works basically is you have a struct in C, and that's the GTK widget class struct. And there are functions, there are function pointers in this struct that you override as you implement your own widgets. And basically what they're doing is they are removing certain functions and replacing them with other things. So that means that people who maintain their own custom widgets, like us, have to change to those new ways. And in most cases, these aren't exactly straightforward conversions. They're deleting a whole bunch of stuff and replacing it with maybe 2 or 3 functions. So that's something that we have to adapt to. There are also some other areas where we need to improve. For example, OpenGL drawing has changed quite a bit. We have OpenGL support in SWT. We have to make sure that works. It's not as stable right now as it should be. And in GTK4, they're changing it also a little bit, so you can draw on almost anything. And we're going to have to add support for that. We also have G notifications, which is the native notification system on GTK. Right now, SWT doesn't have native notifications. So, for example, in GNOME, if you're running XChat or something and someone pings you, you get that little drop down at the top that comes through the clock and the calendar. So, SWT doesn't support that right now. So, it would be ideal if we could. So we can hook into the native notification system and send a notification. There's also one other change that I probably should have put in bold here because it's a pretty big one, but in GTK4 all widgets will be able to be containers. So in SWT right now the divide is between widgets and containers. For example, we have composite, we have canvas, we have scrollable. Those are container widgets. And then you have normal widgets like text, tree, table, list, blah, blah, blah. There's a long list of them. In GTK4, they're going to say, okay, well, if you're a GTK widget, you can also be a GTK container, which means that you can do a whole bunch of stuff and you can have children and you can reorder them and stuff. And in SWT, this is a bit of a problem for us because we have API to set the order of windows. We have some container API, and if all widgets are going to be able to be containers, that will be a little bit tricky. So we have to go through that. And then there are some drawing changes as well. And if any of you are more interested in GTK4, there's actually a roadmap. You can test out some of the new features. I'm not sure how interested in GTK everyone here is, but if you want to give them your input or you have a wish list for something, now would be the time since it's in active development. And that's it. That's all I have to say. Are there any questions? Yeah, sorry, at the back, yeah.
How do you test all that stuff? I mean, there are so many versions. We have virtual machines or
No, we don't have virtual machines, thank goodness. I mean, we do. There are some things you need a virtual machine to test. By and large, what we do is we compile GTK on our local machine. You can download the dependencies on Git. You compile it manually. It takes about 5 minutes. And then out of that, you get some SO files, some binaries, bindings, and you can feed them to SWT, and then your application will run on that version. So for example, I have pretty much all the GTK3 versions compiled on my machine, and if I want to test a snippet on that version, I'll just change the run configuration, and I'll change the environment variable load library path, and you're away to the races. Any other questions? Yes?
We've got the problem of all the draw cells in the tree view
Mm-hmm.
not shown.
Not showing?
So now the background color now other drawings inside.
Is this?
Even the decorations.
Is it on GTK3 or GTK2?
GTK3, so we have always put the switch use on the GTK2.
Okay, I would say file a bug in Bugzilla, post on the mailing list.
It exists.
Okay, I would say post on the mailing list then. So there are only 2 people. I mean.
And the second question then.
Okay.
The acute library should have faced also the same problems.
The acute library?
Yeah, QT.
Oh, Qt. Yeah. Okay. Did they fix the issue or?
No.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I would say post on the mailing list. What happens is, I mean, with only 2 people, if there are bugs in the past that haven't been pinged or someone posted them, then we haven't seen them. I mean, there are still bugs in the Bugzilla from 2002. So I would say post on the mailing list, and I'll keep an eye out for it and take a look at what's going on. Yep.
Is there a favorite version of GTK3 which you would say most of the features are working fine? Or?
I would say GTK 3.16 was one of my favorites. Things were pretty stable then for a while. But honestly, it doesn't really make a difference because the way the GTK release cycle works is they say, yeah, we're going to pick a GTK version, and going forward, that will be the stable version. So GTK 3.16 was nice, but they're not going to support that forever, and there's no theming API for that. So we have to make sure that everything works on GTK 3.22 because that's what they've decided going forward. Okay, that's going to be GTK3. It's 3.22. Yeah. Anything else? Yep.
First of all, I would like to thank you and your company for that support. I think that many Linux users can benefit from that, and obviously no one other steps in and does that. And now to my question, not only as a KDE user, what's your opinion or your information regarding a Qt implementation of SWT?
So there is no Qt implementation of SWT. Will there be one? I mean, if someone comes up with a patch to port it, I'm happy to review it, but the manpower doesn't exist right now in GTK to even think of porting to other platforms. We have our hands full with GTK3 and keeping up with their changes and stuff. That being said, we had a guy a few months ago who came and added a whole bunch of functionality to get GTK working on Windows, and he's contributed probably between 10 and 15 patches, and they all went in pretty quickly. And now we have some basic support for the GTK on Windows. So if there is interest, I mean, I would be happy to look into it more if someone provides a patch, sure.
It's more from the side that Qt already runs from out of Windows.
Yeah, I mean, GTK also, it's been a subject of discussion. I mean, GTK has a unified API. I mean, both me and my colleague are used to the GTK API. So it would be kind of cool if we could get SWT using GTK, at least on Windows, because then if I want to fix Windows bugs, I don't have to learn an entire new toolkit, which is Win32. I can just look at the GTK Windows port and say, yeah, okay, here's where there are some subtle differences, and it would make life a lot easier. But yeah. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.